Hey, I'm Hannah Polasky, and today I'm going to take you through some of my paleo-pathological findings of the resident articulated skeleton at the Old Operating Theatre Museum and Garret. She has been affectionately dubbed Mrs Grieve, and therefore, for the duration of this discussion, I will be referring to her as such. Mrs. Grieve had several assumptions made about her in the past, one of which is that she had syphilis, and another of which is that she wore a corset. Now, these are very important facts because they create a narrative that isn't necessarily something that one can create from a skeleton. So today I'm going to take you through observable pathologies, and then I will discuss the ways in which we can interpret these reasonably. So we're going to start at the top of her head. At the top of Mrs. Grieve's skull, you will notice that there are some small pits. These tend to be caused by different types of anemia. There's some debate as to which kinds of anemia cause it, so reasonably, we can simply say anemia. Moving down, if we look at Mrs. Grieve's teeth, we'll see that there are horizontal striations on them. These are caused by a child who is growing teeth, not getting enough nutrition, and therefore their teeth genuinely stop developing enamel for a bit. That's what causes those little lines. And if we move a little bit lower, we will notice that Mrs. Grieves has some polishing on her upper humerus. Now, polishing happens when a synovial joint, which is your ball and socket joints, really, loses its synovial fluid, which cushions the motion. When that happens, you get bone-on-bone rubbing, which causes polishing. This usually happens with repetitive motion. If we then move a little bit lower and look at Mrs. Grieves's ribcage, this is where older analyses said that it's obvious that corsets were worn. There's one problem with this. Corsets don't actually deform the skeleton unless there are huge other issues, like a really terrible vitamin D deficiency. That's really not the case here, because if it was, Mrs. Grieves's legs would be bowed, and they're not. Also, corsets can deform the angle of the spinous process. Those are the bumps on your spine. They get angled a little bit lower. That's about it. That's not even evident on Mrs. Grieves. There was no, quote, tight lacing done. These facts are incredibly important because if we look at older analysis that was done at the same time as the assertion about corset wearing, we will know that Mrs. Grieves's diet was comprised of a lot of fish. This was very common amongst working class folks. If we look at the fact that Mrs. Grieves has repetitive motion evident on her arms, which also shows some decently large muscle attachments, alongside the fact that she had different deficiencies in her diet, and that she was eating a working class diet, we can reasonably simply assume that Mrs. Grieve was your average working class person whose body was used to teach anatomy after her death. That's all we can really tell. We don't know the exact types of activities she was doing. We don't know what her occupation was, but we do know that she probably did have an occupation. She probably wasn't super wealthy. And it's really important that we, as historians, as people interested in history and in the history of medicine, don't make erroneous assumptions about the past. We cannot overinterpret the evidence before us.